online. First of all, just welcome everyone. So now we're going to be doing the live launch stream for Professor Todd McGowan's latest book, Embracing Alienation, Why We Shouldn't Try to Find Ourselves, which is out now with Repeater Books. This is Adam from Acid Horizon speaking. And of course, just to give a quick introduction to Todd, Professor Todd McGowan, of course, Professor of English at the Vermont University, author of God knows how many books, of course, from Capitalism and Desire, Emancipation After Hegel, one of my personal favorites, and of course, The Racist Fantasy, Enjoyment, Left and Right, and of course, most recently, Embracing Alienation, as well as quite a banging book on David Lynch, I must say.
Oh, thank you.
Let's welcome Todd back to the show. Todd, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Adam. It's great to be here.
So, and of course, no, first and foremost, we're on a podcasting medium here. If you're not listening to Why Theory, first of all, why? Second of all, Theory, you should go listen to it for the Theory, of course, with Ryan Engley. We don't cover anywhere near as much as a psychoanalytic dimensions, or even some of the more German dimensions. I end up being, especially in Acid Horizon, the more token Germanophile of the bunch. So definitely go check it out there. Yeah. But let's start with Embracing Alienation, because the core argument of this book, in a way, is trying to reverse kind of one of the core themes of everything from Marxism to how we understand mental health, to the idea ultimately that Marxism, and this goes before Marx, this always goes back to some extent to some readings of Hegel, some readings of people like the young Hegelians, especially people like Feuerbach, is that we are alienated from our identity. There is something wrong with the way in which our identity appears in the world. There's a contradiction there, and that contradiction, that non-identity in the heart of the appearance of our identities in this world, is something that itself needs to be negated, needs to be stripped away, and we need to return to identity, or at least create an identity free of these negations. And of course, Todd, you go through this through culture, literature, psychoanalysis, the entire breadth of sources here. But let's just start off with the core sort of key term here. What does it mean to be alienated? Because this term has a history, of course. Psychologists used to be called alienists, alienation as being othered. But your argument seems to focus on it predominantly, and indeed encompassing many of these senses, in terms of a logic of non-identity. How can we unpack that term?
Right. So two things I would say. First of all, that alienation is, I would oppose, just like you described, to identity. Mm-hmm. So having a sense of like who you are, or a sense of belonging, right? Like I belong to a certain community, I belong to a certain group, and that would be not alienated. And so alienated would be not having that sense of belonging. I think the second thing that's important for me is that you're alienated from a place, right? Like you don't have a place, you're uprooted from a place. And so I do talk a little bit about modernism as a project, and the way that it's about, or the modern epoch is about, this uprooting from place. And I mean, to some extent, capitalism is part of that. But then I think capitalism ultimately betrays that uprooting pretty quickly by promising some way to belong. In fact, that's why people accumulate like they do, I think, ultimately.
And it seems so I think when we last spoke, we predominantly frames sort of the question of alienation less in terms of alienation, but more in terms of contradiction. Is this contradiction, this alienation, it's not just a matter of historical facts in your argument. Of course, it's always mediated historically, but it seems to be something that's constitutive of what it means to be, I guess, human, even though humans itself are kind of a fuzzy identity, if we take it.
Yeah, human, or I mean, I'm really drawn to this term. I spent maybe too much time on it in the book, subjectivity, right? Like I try to say Kant is really the first person to use this term in the way that we use it today, and I think it's pretty. But I think it's not like, just this. I think to your point, it's not just that subjectivity is invented. Subjectivity, that alienated subjectivity, is born with the first speaking being. So I think that's not. I think you're right. Like there's a radically non-historicist dimension to my argument. Like it's not about this historical development of alienation at all. It's about alienation is just the fact of humanity, or if you will, like, or the way that humanity is always in some way inhuman, right? Like it's never fully human, right? There's always something that's off about it. And I think so that's, I think, always true. I don't think, I mean, there may be epics where alienation becomes the promise of getting out of it becomes clearer, and there, but I don't know about that. I mean, maybe there's always some ruling order that's trying to find a promise, at least a cure for alienation, whether it's the church or capital or there's some kind of order that's saying, look, invest in us, invest in this thing, and then you can get over your alienation. And I think that, to me, that's the oppressive gesture. And you're right, it's kind of cuts against this whole history of trying to overcome alienation. I like how you link it to Feuerbach. I think that's real. I think you're right that a certain reading of Hegel sees the whole project in Hegel. I think this is how the young or left Hegelians took him, as it's a project of overcoming alienation, because there is a sense in which he's critical of like Roman society, calls it the Entfremdete society, Gesellschaft. So I think that's, just because you called yourself a Germanist, I'm going to say things in German on the podcast. But I think that's, I think that the problem for Hegel, the problem with Rome society is it's not alienated enough, right? Like there's like, and you're right, that contradiction is in a way Hegel's pet term for alienation, at least in my reading of him.
I'm going to hold myself back from cracking into the culture section of phenomenology, because we're already 7 minutes in. I don't want to. We have 19 people in the chat. I don't want to scare anyone off by talking about Bruno Bauer, which is rightfully scary, because he's probably one of the best examples of an identity-focused dialectics which causes oppression.
For sure.
This is why Marx has to write, on the Jewish question. But let's me hold myself back and take it back to there's a question about some of the sort of real philosophical influences on this argument, because it seems to start from predominantly kind of like a Sartrean position. As you say, it's not just historical, it's more of a it gives like a transcendental horizon of subjectivity, which and if anything, the history in your description is like the history of us constantly trying to overcome it, not the history that leads towards us overcoming it. And so could you unpack sort of this transcendental kind of argument, I guess, you seem to get from like sort of mostly Sartre? Of course, Hegel is very much in there with the dialectics. That's how he gets into Sartre, I guess. Yeah,
I think so. I think that's right. I mean, I think it's I would say, we were talking about this a little bit before we got on. I think it's the most Sartrean book that I've written. And I think that one of the things about that is that I think Sartre really has a sense of this out of jointness of subjectivity that is inherent to the subject, that it's all, I mean, he thinks of it primarily in terms of what he calls ecstasies, like temporal, like either you're out of yourself in the past, you're out of you can't be in the present, or you're out of yourself because you're always thinking about the future. And what he doesn't think, of course, is the idea that there's always an unconscious that's alongside you as a subject. And for me, that's really important, because I think in a way embracing alienation is embracing the unconscious, and that's something that's I think a real pretty radical limitation on the Sartrean perspective. But I think that's where, like, that out of jointness, I think I even quote that line from Hamlet, "The time is out of joint, oh cursed spite that ever I was born to set it right." Like that makes it seem like, oh, I can set it right, but of course Hamlet was wrong, he couldn't set right the time. But that out of jointness, I think, and then there's a great novel by Philip K. Dick called Time Out of Joint too, which I maybe is a reference to that Hamlet line, but also is in some way the same kind of idea. But yeah, I think that it does have that transcendental status because of this dislocation of subjectivity from itself, and the way that identity is constantly posed as this, just as you were saying, this kind of cure for that alienation that you never fully are it. Like, I think everyone's experiences this, to my mind, right? You think like, oh, I'm whatever, I want to be a certain, I want to, like, to me, I'm a you mentioned that I was professor. I hate this term, but like I'm going to go to university. For the first time ever, I'm going to go to the graduation this Sunday, and I'm going to have to wear the garb. I've never worn it before. And I'm supposed to play the part of professor, but I feel completely alienated from it. But I think even the person who feels most like they are a professor still has that kind of distance. And one of the things I say is that the very effort to be the thing betrays that you aren't the thing, right? Like the more you have to try to be or proclaim even that I am this thing, that the distance that you have from it becomes evident.
I mean, I completely empathize. I mean, I remember when I was picking up, I went to my undergraduate, this was years ago, my undergraduate sort of, graduation ceremony, and they don't give you your diploma, they give you a little plastic roll for the photograph. You hire these robes. I'm like, this is clearly I'm conferred upon a degree. I have to wear this apron-like robe. This is kind of like a quasi-Masonic kind of ritual. I don't feel like I feel like I've done nothing with the more you give me this, despite the fact, I said I was saying to my parents, no, just put a copy of my thesis on the wall. But even that wouldn't be ultimately it. And even thinking of a line from Game of Thrones when the little boy king says, "I am the king," and then he says, "Well, if you have to say that, then
there you go." There you go. Exactly.
It's this betrayal of language. And just to pick up on that aspect, because of course I know you're a Lacanian scholar. For Lacan, the unconscious is structured like a language, and it's language that betrays our alienation in that framework. There's a really interesting move you make in this book, which is to say that the unconscious, to sort of supplement Sartre in this way, is to say that for Sartre, we're condemned to be free by this sort of collapse of identity, this constitutive contradiction in identity. But as you say, Sartre doesn't have as much of a place for the unconscious in that particular argument. And so what you do, it seems, is to make the unconscious, in a way, kind of the vehicle of this freedom, the thing that Sartre can't quite acknowledge because it is a little bit too self-conscious in the sense of radical affirmation. That existentialist idea. I'm going to create my own meaning. There's too much of an idea. So how does the unconscious interact with this alienation and maybe become the bearer of it in a kind of in a sense of freedom, I guess? Yeah,
it's a great question. I mean, it's a perfectly put question. I think that's exactly the limitation of Sartre, because he thinks if you avow the unconscious, you eliminate the space for freedom, right? And I want to say almost exactly the opposite, because I think the unconscious is how we, like, what we think consciously is we're thinking, we're given certain determinations, certain dictates, and we're responding to them, right? So you can easily kind of trace, I think, certain determinations, certain necessities in our conscious line of thinking. But Freud's whole wager about the unconscious is that it responds otherwise to these demands, right? Like a certain demand is made on you and you respond not in a self-interested way, but let's say in a self-destructive way, right? But you could never consciously make that decision. And so that's why Freud doesn't say this, but that's why I think that the unconscious is actually the locale or the site of freedom, right? Like it is, because it doesn't just heed the dictates of what's the self-interest of this, what's the interest of society, what's your self-interest, any of these things. Like it has its own logic that it follows, that doesn't just follow from the demands that are given to it. So that's why for me it's a site of freedom in a way that, for Sartre that would be crazy what I'm saying. So I think that is one point where I think the book is Sartrean, but that's like the most anti-Sartrean point. And I think it's more Freudian. And also I think there's a way that Hegel's thought can, I mean, Hegel didn't have an idea of the unconscious really, but I think there's something in him because of that emphasis on the unsurpassability of contradiction that's really close to Freud.
I mean, there's definitely space for it in Hegel. I mean, in terms of like the implicitness of things,
right.
Only when you when you experience it, then they come. I don't know how to explain this to someone like yourself. This is mostly for anyone who's not too clean up on the Hegel, of course. To sum up Hegel in the phrase "fuck around and find out." It's only when you find out from testing out your particular your criterion of identity in the world, the identity of your knowledge and what you know, and then when that breaks, then you can say, okay, I wasn't constrained by that in the way I thought I was. And
that's a really Sorry, what were you going to say? That's a
No, no,
very,
no, no, that was it.
oh, it's too bad because maybe this is greatest thing ever said that I screwed up. But I think I really like that. That's where I think you're right. Exactly where Hegel sees on like there's room for Freudian unconscious, right? Because he thinks it's in the act that you reveal yourself, and you have a certain whatever theory idea of what is what you are and what you believe, but it's what you do that really reveals the truth of that. And I think it's so psychoanalytic, right? Like Freud, like if you're recounting your dream to Freud, you said, well, okay, there was this figure in the dream, and I think it was my mother. I mean, no, it was actually my girlfriend. Then he would go like, and you said, look, I didn't mean what I said. I really, it was, and he would say, sorry, like what you actually did or what you actually said reveals the truth of your desire. And I think that's a very Hegelian position, right? That what we do, like I was saying to someone that like I was supposed to make a appointment to go see the doctor for a certain thing, and I just never made it. And so I'm like, okay, so clearly I didn't want, my desire didn't want to go to this doctor's appointment, right? Like it's not like the not doing it or the doing it is the truth of your desire. And I think that's a good Hegelian Freud intersection.
I think it's definitely that aspect of the implicit becoming explicit, I think, which separates sort of the unconscious of Hegel from someone like, sorry, listeners, we're getting more German, Schelling. Because Schelling to me is like, he's the guy who places the unconscious as a site of freedom, which is, I think, is really interesting, but it's about suspension of that dialectic. It's that sort of thing underneath it, which I think there's some truth to that. But for Hegel, for Hegel, I think it reminds me a lot of the first resistance of psychoanalysis, which is in a psychoanalysis, one of the first most common kind of resistance listeners is that the analysand, the person on the couch, will basically try to be the analyst. They will tell them what they want, and then, okay, what's your problem? Well, my problem started when I was young and my mother didn't give me this, and then we work out, okay, it's not this, because you're trying to get out of the way. This is actually itself a kind of resistance. And I think one of the ways to bring in Hegel here, and not just to turn this into the Hegel show, because I think it turns into a key theme towards the latter parts of the book, is around the question of like engagement, and not just embracing, but particularly in the form of engagement. So what I mean, so for example, in the Hegel's phenomenology, when consciousness kind of gets a sense that all of its attempts at undoing its alienation all end up sort of collapsing on themselves or backing off on themselves. It becomes what Hegel calls the beautiful soul, which is essentially trying to retreat from the world and make sure nothing gets corrupted, nothing gets alienated. But of course, the more you retreat from everything and you're retreating from it, you let that determine you more than yourself does. And so that actually inverts the whole process. And so what your sort of argument tends to lean towards is this question of embracing, but also engaging with our alienation. And I want to ask, how does one navigate that embrace, that engagement? Because it can't just be sort of learning retrospectively, sort of almost not a priori, but sort of knowing, if you think, okay, alienation is unavoidable, therefore we can't avoid it, therefore we're not going to try and avoid it, we're not going to try and mediate it, because that would be kind of it would produce saying like there is no identity, therefore I'm not going to try, and then you would end up being identifying as just non-identity. It requires a more sort of on the ground kind of engagement of alienation in your work, and I just want to ask sort of how that engagement sort of plays out, because it's not just because we can't simply, as you say, we can't simply, in the book as well, you give a great example of what does it mean to be completely alienated. That's being dead. That's a total otherness of all being, and it's this kind of dialectical dance, maybe even a bacchanalian revel, if you want to put it in Hegelian terms. And what does that engagement look like? Because there are no total solutions, of course.
Right. I think that's. I mean, maybe that's one of the good answers, right? Like, I think it is because I think your point is really subtle, that you can't. It's easy to see retroactively the way that the alienation was always present in these things where I thought I was achieving identity, or in a psychoanalytic session, or in Hegel can see it when he's writing out the phenomenology. But I think it's another thing to make it into a philosophy of practical engagement, right? And I think that I think what it means is like precisely like not. I do say this, that a certain amount of identity is absolutely necessary, right? Like one can't operate in the world without symbolic identity. So it wouldn't be like, it would be perverse to say, I'm not going to allow anyone to use any, it's like, I don't want you to call me by any name. I'm not going to have any name on my book. I'm just going to be a book. I mean, that would be perverse. So it's not a question of like doing without the symbolic identity altogether. It's a question, I think, instead of where do you place the emphasis, right? And I think one of the ways to do that is to not seek out the solution, or to just try to see in certain political movements and emphasize in political movements the way in which what is really driving them is precisely this embrace of alienation, not this how can we overcome alienation. So one of the wagers of the book is how you theorize, and this is of course very Hegel contra Marx, how you theorize a movement really, really shapes the nature of the movement. So if we see, even retroactively, if we see, I think I bring up the example of Rosa Parks not sitting on the bus, right? Like if we see, well, what is she doing? She's like insisting on her alienation. Then that, I think, rather than like trying to say, I want to be part of this larger community, this white community that gets to ride in the front of the bus, right? Like to me, I think once you see it that way, then the battle's already lost. So I think like thinking about how we see these fights is a really, really important thing for me.
And one of the key ways which you frame these particular, these fights, these struggles, is through a distinction which comes out of Hegel, but also usual from Habermas as well, which is the distinction between the public and the community. Could we go into that a bit? Because it seems like the public is predominantly more about alienation, whereas the community is more about inside of identity.
Exactly. That's, yeah, it's funny because part of it is my own, I think I wrote that chapter initially out of my own intrinsic repulsion from whenever anybody invokes the term community, because people invoke it all the time and it always kind of just rubs me the wrong way. And so, but I think, and then I was like, well, why is that? And I think it's because the idea of community promises like you can belong to this group, however big its size is, although it can't be universal, because to be a community, there has to be people on the outside of it so that we can define ourselves as a community. And then the public, what I like about the idea of the public is that there's no, you don't control, like there's the barrier between, there's no clear barrier between the inside and the outside, right? Like anybody can come in. Like I like this idea of the public park, right? Like you can't, I mean, I do point out that there are historically examples where public parks are limited. And of course, if a public park is in a certain area, it becomes hard to access for certain people. All that's true. But the very nature of the public park is anyone can go into it and anyone can be there during the time that it's open. So I think that that's a real, I really like that about the public. Like, I think that's the radical edge of the public. And that's, and in the public, you can, and I think all of us feel this when we're in public, you never feel totally yourself. Unlike when you're just among your little community, then you can feel like, oh, I'm kind of here. I really belong. I'm part of things. But if I'm out in public, I feel like I was thinking about I have a little bit on the movie Speed, and one of the things in Speed is I think it's really, really important that we as spectators, when the film was made, people thought, it's going to be this garden variety action film. No one's going to see it. And then it was a humongous hit. And I think the reason why is because people felt like they could identify with this public on the bus, and it's just random people thrust together. You never know who you're going to be. Like Sandra Bullock is initially stuck next to actually the guy that plays the one son on Succession. She's stuck next to him and he's annoying and talks to her too. He also played Cameron on Ferris Bueller's Day Off. He's talked to her too much, and I forget his name. And she like puts her gum under the seat, and she's like, or on the seat, she's like, gum, I got to move. So she has to try to get away from him. And that's one thing that's what's alienating about, or that makes our alienation visible to us in the public, is we can be stuck sitting next to someone we don't want to be sitting next to.
No, I think the reasons why you prefer Speed 1 over Speed 2 are very similar to the reasons why I prefer Blade Runner 1 over the Blade Runner sequel.
Interesting. Can you develop that a little bit? Because I'm curious about this.
So, and this is interesting because it's for reasons coming from a completely different textual background.
Okay.
Because for Deleuze-Guattarian reasons, I prefer Blade Runner 1. Because Blade Runner 2, basically, so in Blade Runner 1, this is the replicants are born out of military technology, that they want to escape, they want to strive to have a kind of emancipated community freed from the identity assigned to them by their corporate technological overlords.
Right.
But in Blade Runner 2, they're sort of re-territorialized into the identity that each of them could be the chosen one, because any of them could be born from a mother and therefore reintegrated into the Oedipal Triangle, and they find their community through the fact that all of them could have been, or they think they all might be, this chosen child. Of course, there's definitely a let's say a Hegelian reversal in the fact they all find out that none of them are, apart from one later in the movie. But I feel it reinscribes this identical unity there, and it's interesting that you can approach from either end.
Yeah, I think that's right. Like it's interesting because I have a lot of friends that prefer the second one. There was a whole volume of, I think it's not even called like Lacan and Blade Runner 2049, a whole volume of collected essays on I think I have an essay in it on that film. And I like the film for different reasons, but I think I kind of, it's interesting because I'm far from a Deleuzian, but I kind of see that. Like I think that the first film is all about the alienation of the replicants, and they're able to, and what's his name, Roy Batty, is able to accomplish at the end this incredible ethical act, right? But through his experience of his alienation, and then like his great last speech, and then Deckard too, right? Like and then when the uproar against the first film was when they tried to make Rachel at the end like, oh, she's this kind of exceptional replicant who didn't have a time limit on her, and so she's not going to die soon. And I think that's an attempt to kind of overcome the alienation. I wouldn't have agreed with you when you first said that, but I find your claim pretty convincing.
I mean, it's interesting how many sort of developing out of these two different lineages. Whilst I like to hold myself in the middle between Deleuze and Hegel throughout my studies. It's an impossible task, but that's part of the fun of it.
Yeah.
And but when it comes to, they both seem to have a hostility towards identity. Well, not hostility, but a post-Kantian or a post-Kantian edge towards them. And rather than getting any sort of debate between the two, but there's definitely a question here. There's two questions regarding two key terms throughout the book and Alienation, which is, when we started, of course, you first talked about the ways in which we try to escape our alienation via investing in certain identities that the state offers us or religion offers us. And of course, thinking about investment, thinking about the unconscious, we're talking about desire here. And the way that identity and non-identity, how do they function in desire? Of course, I guess predominantly, of course, still working in this Lacanian, Sartrean, or at least generally sort of desire as lack framework, which goes all the way back to Hegel in the self-consciousness chapter.
For sure. Right. It's interesting because I'm fascinated that you picked up on the word investment, right? Because Freud's term that got translated by Strachey into, it's a crazy translation. His term for what becomes cathexis in Strachey is Besetzung, which in German kind of means investment, right? It means like occupation or investment, and people use it in a capitalist sense. So I find that really interesting, that this link between desire and investment, and I think investment is the way that that negativity of desire. Again, Deleuze would not like this line of thinking, but like the negativity of desire gets, so you could think of alienation, I think, along the lines of the negativity of desire, and then
Mm.
the different like symbolic identity is a Besetzung, is an investment, right? Is a way of like investing that desire in what you think is going to provide a respite from it. But then alienation is, the point of alienation is to say, no, I'm stuck with my contradictory desires without any, no matter what the investment I make, I'm not going to find any respite from that. And I think to me, that's like the through line of the book.
This is definitely more of a Hegel question. If I'm over Hegelianizing the psychoanalytic here, do tell me. But there's one of the things I always found interesting about how Hegel frames desire as lack is that when he frames desire as lack, it's always framed in terms of the structure of everything Hegel does, which is the structure of knowledge. It's the subject lacks itself because by the time that the subject realizes what desire is, it realizes it in the context of trying to understand what it is. It's trying to understand everything about its world. It's trying to understand the objects of its experience. And by the time it understands what desire is, it understands itself as, it basically comes to this idea. Every object is only an object because there's a subject experiencing it. And so, okay, if I want to know the object, I've got to know the subject. And therefore, if I don't know the subject, I've lost the subject. But the subject is me. That's my identity. I don't have myself. Therefore, desire enters the frame. Do you think that the psychoanalytic framework sort of gets around any of the more, I guess, not subjectivist or sort of like idealist, framings of desires structured primarily by knowledge? Or do you think that's the strength of it?
No, I think the question is right. Like that it does, like that. If I had to say, like, even more, because I think we talked about the way Hegel's really engaged in the unconscious in his own way. But I think we could talk about Death Drive, because I don't think there's any Hegelian space for that. But I think that what you're picking up a real disjunction between Hegel and psychoanalysis. That psychoanalysis, like, I think that's maybe its radicality, right? That it breaks from this idea that our desire is desire for knowledge, because I think for Freud, there's no innate curiosity about the world, right? Like that's why he makes that famous statement that every sexual encounter is actually an encounter between 8 people, right? Or I don't know, what is that? Did I make too many? Yeah, between 4 people, right? Between the 2 parents on each side, right? So, and I think that's because you're always, when you're think for Freud, and I think Lacan makes this clearer. That's a weird thing to say, because Lacan doesn't make anything clearer. But maybe he does. That when you're desiring something, you're always asking, why does the other person desire this thing, right? Like you're never just you like when you, this like child's innate curiosity about the world is a curiosity that comes from the fact that they don't know what the other desires in all these things, and that's what they're looking at it. They're saying, should I desire this thing, this little spider that I see out in the world? And the parents like, yeah, find that interesting, that's good, or stay away from that, right? Like there's all, and then they're learning what the other desires, and then when that innate supposedly curiosity, it dissolves when they've kind of got a sense of what the other, I mean, you never master it totally, of course, but they get more of a sense of it. So yeah, I think that's not specifically not a desire for knowledge in psychoanalysis. Whereas I think you're right that in Hegel, it's always a disjunction around what I know. So that I do, and that comes from, I mean, that's Descartes and Kant too, right? Like in that, I don't think Hegel's exceptional. Like he's just a philosopher.
I think that's a good diagnosis. Honestly, Hegel remains the theorist of absolute knowledge, and even if the knowledge is that we can't know it, he at least is the one who sits down and says, "I know it."
Right. I mean, which I think is definitely true. But I also think, like, Freud would never end a book with absolute knowing, right? It would be instead like absolute desire or something, right? Like it'd be some kind of, sure, absolute, but the fact that it's emphasis on knowing, I think, is where you get from the perspective of psychoanalysis, the error of philosophy. And even for
Okay.
Deleuze, I don't think Deleuze would say anything different than that. I think like on that, I think he would follow Freud. I mean, there is this different, like, I think there's ways to reconcile Deleuze and even though he was a great enemy of Hegel, but Deleuze and Freud, Deleuze and Hegel. But I do think the one thing that's the where the bullet hits the bone is the question of like, is desire positive or is it negative, right? Like, I don't think you can fudge your way around that. Like, I think that's just like, you have to decide. Like, I mean, I understand you're trying to play both sides of the fence, but I think ultimately, I think you have to just say, like, am I going to think of desire in this way, or am I going to think of it in that way? Everything else, I think, is actually, you can kind of fudge and bring the two together. But I'm not sure you can.
I mean, either way, it's definitely productive, regardless of what sort of logical slant is. Yeah. I mean, in terms of the question of identity generally, I mean, there's a question in terms of sort of what identity is. Is it? I mean, there's many ways it can be, in terms of what is the identity that's offered to us by force, by things that offer us an escape from alienation. And I guess, what is there an identity first that fails, or is there identity first that ruptures? Is the identity being offered a return to that, or is it something different? And in a sense, if we were stuck in this kind of this Bacchanalian revel, this dance in a way that Hegel may describe it. I mean, for Hegel, there is kind of a reconciliation, but it's this point in which, and this is why I disagree with Deleuze, I think you can actually put some sort of good ground between Schelling and Hegel and some Deleuze, like this, which is that identity becomes a kind of meta stability of difference. You're sort of for Hegel, it's more of a bouncing between the poles, and for Deleuze, it's just the meta stability in the sense of, each second of May is the same second of May, despite the fact that the universe in a different, the galaxy is in a different position in its rotation around other galaxies, etc., etc. But it seems that the sort of the meta stability in the psychoanalytic way of embracing alienation could really be termed, and maybe I'm misinterpreting sort of the conclusion of this book here, which is what Freud calls like common unhappiness.
Yeah.
Which is, in a sense, feels unsatisfying for the ones seeking to escape alienation, but in the way you frame it is actually it's emancipatory, because it lets you get sort of back to the things themselves, so to speak.
Oh, interesting. I like that little Husserl touch. I think that's right. Like, I think that to answer the first part of your question, like, I would contend that identity is never first, right? Like, it's alienation is first, and identity is it retroactively creates this sense that it was lost, but it was never there in the first place. So I think because it can never be there. But I do think like that there is a kind of like the whole idea of embracing alienation is to embrace that there is, I like how you said, a kind of meta stability in this embrace of common unhappiness that Freud talks about. And I think that's really, I found that a really, my spouse and I, she's also a theorist. We quote that line probably every day to each other. Just, okay, it's fine. We're just in common unhappiness, right? Like, and at least we're not in hysterical misery, because that's for Freud, the alternative. So I think that's right. There is a kind of stability in that, and it's a stability of seeing, of not thinking that I have to escape. Some like that I'm already out of the thing that I thought I had to escape from, right? Like I'm like I thought, or I can never get into the thing that I thought I wanted to get into, right? Like whether it's a club or I don't know, like this. I was recently at I was one of the speakers at a Hegel symposium, and I was the odd one out. Like the rest were like good Hegelian scholars who followed like Robert Pippin and I had this really, and it was hard to do it actually, because I had a real sense, like I was invited, there's fine. But I had a real sense of my alienation, right? Like I did not, it was, no one belonged, of course, but it was clear I really didn't belong. And it was really hard for me to say like, okay, just embrace, like, don't cry about it. Just embrace the fact that you're in a group, you clearly don't belong in it. And that's because that's the whole, it's it's one thing to have a philosophy. It's the thing to actually try to like live out the philosophy. And that was helpful to me. So I feel like there is a way you can do that. And there is a kind of, I like what you called it, like meta stability in that.
It seems to be sort of a thing that haunts the history of Hegel scholarship. I mean, my research is on the young Hegelians, and discovering what like the dynamic of that clique was like in the back room of that bar in Berlin, it's very similar to what a Maoist would call a struggle session today, because it would be Feuerbach, and Feuerbach left because of how harsh it was. People like Bruno Bauer and his sort of main lackeys would be sort of cornering people at the bar and saying, "You're secretly Christian. That means you contain the alienate. You're now alienated from your human critical essence. You need to do critical criticism. You do self-criticism." And then you have people like, like someone like Max Stirner sitting in the back of the bar going, "You're never going to achieve." He says, "Well, you're not going to achieve your non-alienated human essence until you are dead. And even then, where's your prize? Like, do you need any proof you're a human being? The fact you're accusing each other of being inhuman by reading, by being a little bit too Christian about things, kind of proves that the proof is in the excess of the category." Yeah. And it's very interesting to phrase it in terms of, I mean, I really want to pursue this idea of the identity is only ever retrospectively posited, because that's a distinctly negative Hegelian move, which actually I think moves it forward from, or is at least an alternative to, other ways in which they've tried people have tried to radicalize negativity of Hegelianism. So, for example, I mean, I can't help but think of sort of basically negative dialectics, something like Adorno, whereas sort of identity is always shown to be false. But it seems like you're taking a different tack. Is that identity is false, but only because it's constituted by alienation, and therefore it's not so much that identity is. For Adorno, I guess, to summarize for listeners, Adorno, the idea is that there's never going to be an identity between concept and object. The concept always overshoots the particularities of the object. The object in its particularity always exceeds the concept, and this is because ultimately the idea of a particular, we're all particular beings, but particularity therefore is a universal, not a particular. So therefore even the concept of particularity can't subsume us, and we're sort of constantly sort of rupturing the falsity of every identity. But there's something a bit, there's no psychoanalytic dimension to that for. And I think there's a negativity in sort of the dialectics that you're putting forward here, which really tries to reintegrate those points of unconscious differentiation. I don't know if there's anything.
I really love that point, actually, because I think that, to me, I think Adorno in Negative Dialectics says something like, the name dialectics says nothing more at first than objects don't go into their concepts without leaving a remainder, right? And I think what a non-Hegelian point that is, like, because Hegel's point would be, no, concepts, the whole point of the concept is the concept doesn't go into itself without leaving a remainder. There's no, like, you're only accessing the object through the concept. It seems like it's almost a kind of empiricist objection to Hegel, and way too dualist and not dialectic. So that's always, no, I was going to say it always annoyed me, but it didn't, because when I first read that book, I was like, oh my God, the scales fell from my eyes. And then I seriously looked at Hegel, and I didn't think that anymore. But I think that the what you're saying is that there's a way that the embrace of alienation, if you understand it through the unconscious, isn't just stuck in this like particular doesn't fit problem, right? Because it's more about how you're in touch, and this comes back to the whole discussion of the public versus the community, right? Like, it's more about how we don't fit ourselves universally, right? And so, like, Adorno was really allergic to the idea of universality. In fact, I think I'm tempted to say that our contemporary, it's Foucault too, but the contemporary like political distancing from universality really owes a debt to Adorno, but that probably inflates his importance too high in the popular imagination. It's probably Foucault and other thinkers. But I think that like what this allows you to see is the way that universality is in this distance from ourselves, and it's not the failure of particularity to fit. It's like the failure of the universal to fit itself, right? Like that, and that's what's universal. So I think that, or the failure of the concept to fit itself, and that's what's universal. Like I think that's a nice psychoanalytic move away from what Adorno says about Hegel, because that whole book is basically it's a 500-page book. It's a 500-page diatribe against Hegel with a little diatribe against Heidegger put in there. Which is funny, because don't you think his 3 essays on Hegel is quite good? It's quite good on Hegel. Like, yeah, I mean, it really, so there's a kind of, it's almost like a schizophrenia, or something happened to him in like 1963. And then he just kind of, he turned against, it's really, I think, a turn against Hegel. I don't understand it really.
I mean, the concept of experience in the second essay is kind of a lot closer. I mean, I haven't read stuff like Buck and Morse on this. I've got to admit, I'm mostly coming from the Hegel studies and a bit of negative dialectics. But yeah, no, absolutely, I take your point. I mean, in terms of universality, though, I mean, that's a question. How do we articulate universality in terms of the failure of universality? Because if it's that case, the failure of universality is always on the side of universality. Why do we not find him? Why can we not embrace our alienation in the community rather than the public? Because if we embrace it in the community, because if we say like we failed at a community here, but we still want to band together because these differences in a way, we still have some, maybe let's say even safety, to be honest, because the public can be sort of a hostile place for various.
It can be hostile, yeah.
But
Yeah.
This aspect of tactical withdrawal there. I mean, this may not be. This doesn't have to be a book of tactics, of course. It's a book about, it's a philosophy text first and foremost. Right. I'm not asking for cookbooks for the future, but when we put the failure of universality on the side of universality, is that failure going to be the public, or is the public a place that challenges the community, or can the community in a way challenge itself?
Yeah, I think it can. Yeah, Alex, I think that makes sense. Like, I think you can have this like internal challenge to the community, right? Like that seems, I don't see a problem with that. Like, but that, I think the problem is that it is dissolving of the community, right? Like once you have those internal challenges, as soon as they're really articulated, then the community dissolves. And I think, but look, I do think you're right. And that there is a sense in which you form community. Like but again, I guess I would say, sorry, I'm thinking too much while I'm answering. But I was just thinking like, okay, yeah, you do. There's certain kind of like, sometimes you need some kind of self-protection, right? Like against this oppressive society. But I guess I would say 2 things. What's oppressive is never the public. In my mind, it's never the public. What's oppressive is a community that's taken over the public. Like that's what happens. That's what happens like in this the bus situation, like where if you were black, you had to go to the back of the bus. Like, right, the white public basically took over. Sorry, the white community basically took over the public space of the bus, right? And so that's why I think, in a way, the response to it by the civil rights movement was to insist upon, no, you can't have this control over this as a community. And I think in a way, like that has to be the response. And if we look at, say, I mean, I think Black Lives Matter did the same thing, right? Like in the US, that it was the point was, okay, this is police officers are public agents, but they're acting like they're members of the white community when they go and shoot unarmed black civilians, right? So I think that's from kids up to however old. So I think that's to me, that's how we should think of the response. Like I'm not, just like you said, it's not a cookbook of it's not like Andreas Malm, like how to blow up a pipeline or something, right? But I am saying, like, let's think of the critique of the counter movement in terms of the defense of the public, not as, oh, there's this retreat into a private community, right? Like, and I think that's a really crucial thing, because it allows you to say, like, oh, okay, a certain kind of movement came up that seems like it's identitary in response to an oppressive society, right? But maybe it's not. Maybe it's like an attempt to try to say, like, stop co-opting the public, right? And that's what I guess that's one of the things that I'm trying to do in the book.
No, I completely get it. I mean, this we've seen even recently with the amount of ways in which all these many struggles have been, especially being on pro-Palestine marches, how they've all intersected, not in the sense of which we're all showing up as like competing teams. It's so much as no, we've seen sort of by these encounters and sort of good theoretical political education, the intersection of all these struggles, such that liberation of one liberates all the others, and doesn't even require the boundaries of that community for that very protection. And I think you're
exactly,
right.
exactly, yeah, exactly.
It's generalizing anxiety.
Yeah, I think that's really good. I totally agree with that. That there's a way, and it's interesting how that movement has become today, like that point at which this like universal emancipatory struggle gets articulated. I think like that. I think you never know where that's gonna happen, right? Like it never. Like why did it happen there? It could have happened. I mean, it could have. I mean, it's interesting where it didn't happen. I mean, that's what I would say too. Like it didn't. Like I was just reading today about Haiti. You basically cannot leave, and Haiti's like a total. It's like basically like a murderous gang controlled war zone. Like it's a horrible place today, and you cannot leave. Like Dominican Republic closed the border, and all these neighboring countries like Bahamas, they've like put a blockade around so that you can't. No one can get out. The airport's closed. And you can't, but the one thing that the one import that can come in, guns. Like they let the guns, food can't come in, but guns, that's fine. So it's interesting that didn't. This is not a critique of the other movement. It's just I'm saying like I think you never know where the thing, like where the movement is going to be, that then becomes this thing that we see the universal articulated in this one particular moment that sort of, I mean, what does it do? It kind of brings the overall contradiction brings it evident, right? And so I think that's I think that's, it seems like the the struggle against this Israeli annihilation of Palestine I think that's become the point at which that universal is being articulated today.
Well, it's an anti-apartheid logic by literal, even by definition of apartheid, isn't it? To that extent, of the identitarian nature of it.
Right. It's interesting because I was in college in the late 1980s, and it was very similar. We did this big. I mean, it's my political awakening. I was part of this whole divest in South Africa, right? Like that was the big thing, and that I mean, it's so apparent that it was very identitarian, right? Like the logic there.
Absolutely. Okay, so I know we're coming out to see. I just want to open up some of the questions we've just got in the chat. We've got still maintaining a good healthy over 20 folks in the chat. Let me pull some stuff up. Okay. Good bit of Freudian tripartism here from Comrade Ben. Let's pull up the question from Ben. Could we say that universality and generality is on the side of das Ding, the real, and the superego, while particularity and uniqueness is on the side of the id, which is the superego as reaction? That's beyond my psychoanalytic chops, but Todd,
no, I'm not sure I understand that question. Maybe you got too many terms in it. I think I would.
There's a second part to the question.
Okay, good. Yeah, I guess I would just. I would think. I would almost reverse it, right? Like I would almost say that. Okay, I would think of a couple of things. Like I think I would almost say that universality is more on the side of, if I don't really love these id, ego, superego terminology, but essentially id. But I would think universality seems to be more on the side of the id, if the id is our disjunction, and I think that is how you have to think of it if you want to retain that as a concept. But I think superego is Freud says it reaches down into the id for its psyche, that energy that it has. And it is, I think Lacan's theory of it as this command, he says this imperative to enjoy. But I think that's on the side of particularity. And I think we can see it pretty clearly in Capital, because there's this demand for you to be unique, right? Like be yourself, be who you are, be all you can be. I think those are all particularist injunctions. So I guess I do not see the superegoic injunction as universalist. I see it as much more this particular, like, I think, and this is kind of an Adorno point, anti-Adorno point. I don't think of capitalism as the reign of the universal. I think of it as the reign of particularism. Like, I think that's what it is. And so yeah, I don't think of superego. I think of superego as associated with that, like, be a particular. Like, a particular is part of a community too, right? Like, I think every community is a particular community. It's not universal. Community can't be universal. So I think that's why to join a community is to try to achieve your particularity. Like, that's what you're trying to do.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, sorry, but I know there's not much space in the stream comments to always get things going. But sorry, but we're getting this. We're getting this. I know you got another one going down the line as well. But also know one from Saint Max, of course, which is not me. Well, it's not me for once.
Too bad.
Some further up in discussion.
Okay. Yeah. I think that's absolutely right. Just totally agree with that. That if you have it, you don't have to chase it, right? Like, that seems, it's interesting to make the link to toxic masculinity, because I think toxic masculinity is the chase for masculinity, right? Like, I had a student say to me, wait a minute, we don't need the term toxic masculinity because masculinity itself is toxic. I kind of liked that as an idea, but I think the idea, what I think the toxicity of it is the pursuit of it. So I think it's an interesting example.
It's kind of the macho-ness of the self-consciousness in Hegel's Master.
Yeah, exactly.
Prove I am I, but I have to destroying, negating everything, and then subjugating something else. And I always found it interesting because it's always we never the perspective always jumps in that chapter, because we start off with the one self-consciousness, and then when it enslaves the other, then we jump to the other side. And then I always thought, well, hold up, you've posited that. I know it's an epistemological thing, so it does make sense, but from like an anthropological thing, I'm like, well, no, we didn't ask the other self-consciousness, but then we're already in it's already caught in the other's desire, which I always thought was a really fascinating way.
I know. Well, I think it's because I think that's why you can't really understand it anthropologically, and I think that's why Kojève is just completely wrong as a reader of Hegel, because I think it is just really, these are just theories of knowledge for him, right? Like, these are ways to understand experience, and if you think these are actual historical, I said this, by the way, at this Hegel symposium, and they thought I was a lunatic. If you think these are actual things that people have ever lived out, you just missed the. I said, for Hegel, there's never been a Stoic. Even Chrysippus, he was not like, that's the whole point of the Stoicism section in self-consciousness, is to show the Stoic who thinks that she or he is a Stoic is not a Stoic, right? And I think that's why Hegel wrote the book, to show all these identities that people try to take up. They don't have them, even though they think they do.
Okay, one more from Conrad Ben. We got one other one in the chat below that. Let's go to Ben's first. It's in the queue. Go back to negation and post-structuralism. Bit of Heidegger as well.
Yes, the Heideggerian.
As in, do you mean, Ben, sort of the negation, as in if we negated post-structuralism, or negation as it works in post-structuralism?
I think he means the negation of post-structuralism as a no to difference. Yeah. But why is that a yes to? I don't think that there's as opposed to shadow of incalculability in Hegel's Age of World Picture. I'm not sure I understand that question. But thanks. I think that
discipline. Okay, yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, I think that I'm not really comfortable with the term post-structuralism. It's probably Ben knows, but I think that it's I wouldn't say it's a negating of difference. Although this is maybe where we'd have a Deleuze Hegel argument. Like, I think it's a way of thinking difference through contradiction, rather than as ontological, right? Like, I think that's the difference. Like, that for those certain thinkers, like Deleuze, Derrida. Not that they could even be grouped together, but
Yeah.
I just did it. But I think actually on this they could be grouped together. That different. There's a certain ontological primacy of difference, right? And I think for Badiou too, actually. And I think that for Hegel there's a ontological primacy of contradiction, and I think from contradiction emerges difference in Hegel. And I think for Deleuze, that contradiction is a way of, it's like identity's revenge on difference. I think that's what he would say.
He said something along the lines of like contradiction is different seen from below or something.
Yeah.
It's because he's going back to Kant and Schelling. That's why I always like put them in conversation, because I see them. It's a very English way of reading Deleuze as basically two competing post-Kantians, which is why I always find it interesting to play them off against each other. And speaking of playing off against each other, and Conrad, we can't just make this the Deleuze v Hegel beef, but okay. Is there a similarity between embracing alienation and dismantling the face?
Absolutely, right. Like I think embracing alienation. I assume this is one part of the question, is a non-Levinasian ethic, right? Like it's not, or politics. It's not about respecting the face, right? Like it's because like the other never is its face and you are never your face, right? Like it's not like the face reveals sort of the truth of the other or anything. I think that those things we should really avoid that way of thinking. Because it's like what you're respecting in the other is precisely the other's alienation from itself and from its face, to my
mind. Yeah, because of the face, I mean, there's almost certainly a reference in there. I hope I'm not getting your comment wrong, listener, to the faciality plateau, which is essentially about the face as a hegemonic machine which gives people identities. Their paradigmatic example is the face of Christ, which is given a white face, and you're placed under these identical machines through various kinds of habituation. And I think, I mean, habit, I mean, if we want to, I'm not going to reach my copy of Henry Summers Hall's great book, Hegel, Deleuze, and the Critique of Representation, but it is kind of, that is one of the most they do converge in terms of problems. Solutions, no, but problems very much. But yeah, and anyone else from the chat have any questions before we wrap up? I mean, anything additional? I mean, hell, we did go through some of the filmic examples, even many of the political examples in this book, but then, you know, let's end something on there's definitely furthering actually of a critique of a certain strain of Marxism actually in this book, which goes, I mean, at least from my reading of your work, goes back to the problems of it in sort of emancipations after Hegel. Yeah. We talk about framing communism in terms of disalienation, in terms of framing all anti-capitalism in terms of alienation, and this is very much you can see it in Marx in terms of, especially sort of some parts of the German ideology, depending on how you read it. There's various scholastical debates about whose handwriting is what.
Right.
You know, Engels writes, you know, fish in the morning, farm in the afternoon, and then Marx says afterwards, criticize after dinner, which seems to be a little bit of, what the fuck are you talking about? Or it could be his saying, well, now we can finally be philosophers.
Right.
But, I mean, your engagement, Marx, definitely has developed, of course, since then. I'm wondering, when you talk about how an embracing of alienation could sort of retool or reinvigorate certain kinds of Marxisms that may even get stuck in this kind of maybe very left Hegelian or young Hegelian mode.
Yeah, I think that would be the danger, right? Like, I think but I think that, I really like that it's a way of, and I think Marx himself, I mean, I do say that there's a way in which he doesn't move away enough from this early, that even the critique of the fetishism of the commodity, there's still an idea of like overcoming that fetishism. And the famous thing in Capital Volume 3 of I think I talk about this, the relationship between the realm of necessity and the realm of freedom. Like, I think that seems to me, he still doesn't see the way in which that are, and maybe the thing about your second reading of what he wrote in German Ideology, right? Like that would be along the lines of my critique, that is there this way that he's still invested in some kind of like, we take care of necessity and then freedom is just this thing on top. Whereas for Hegel, I think, and for me, it's no, freedom is always has this problem of necessity or this problem of alienation written into it. And in fact, that is our freedom. So yeah, I don't think, I guess that would be my critique, that like that. And I've always, I guess it's like, I understand that Marx is not at all utopian, but I think that maybe there's this line of like thread of utopian thinking that gets into his thought, and that's what I am. When I'm talking about Marx, I'm trying to kind of get that out of there.
Well, it's another good link, of course, to draw as you do between Hegel and psychoanalysis, is that for Hegel, at least in terms of the most famous, but the self-consciousness parts, part of the freedom from necessity of being caught in our conception of things is in the way of freedom to do, basically to undermine ourselves, in a way, even to do harm to ourselves,
Right.
And that's kind of where the psychoanalytic, I guess, would come in, because we can be true to our desire even by betraying it, maybe.
Right. I mean, Hegel famously says that the superiority of humanity, the rest of creation, is evinced in its ability, the fact that humans kill themselves and other animals don't. And that's not like much, is that really superiority, right? Like, I think that's pretty, that really, I think that he thinks like, you're freed from necessity. What are you going to, you're more likely to kill yourself. So I think that that's a real, that's a strain in Hegel that sort of drops out in Marx.
Was it Hegel says in 1828, the most rational, for lectures on the philosophy of spirit, the most rational thing a child can do with his toys is break them. But we have one final question from Comrade Ben. I'm just going to put it up here. Have either of you read Freddie Perlman, and how do we feel about the organism versus the corpse? I haven't heard of.
I haven't either. I can't.
Good question.
Can't say
the organism versus theories of organisms. I mean, this Schelling is just hovering. I mean, the corpse is going to be pretty alienated.
Right. I think or it's the end of alienation, but it's also the end of existence. So yeah, I think I'm certainly on the side of the corpse. I mean, does the organism? I'm not talking about Perlman because I have no idea about him. But I think like the organism. That's why Deleuze is critical of the organ, right? Because it promises a certain wholeness and identity. And I think, I don't know, I want to say that, but the organ is also constantly undermining itself. I mean, that seems to be the psychoanalytic point about the organ.
It's the corpse, the body of our organs. We will never know. But on that note, just one final question, Todd. I mean, are you working on anything else currently after this? I mean, obviously you've put out quite a few books in the past couple of years.
I can't write too many books. Actually, I have a book which is someone said this to me. I think it's true. It's called Pure Excess. It's my most Marxist book. So it's really about how surplus, how excess really defines the capitalist epoch, and it really isn't totally indebted to Marx, but like with a psychoanalytic twist. So, and then I wrote there's a new Cambridge companion to Lacan that came out, which I got roped into doing it in uninteresting ways. And then, so that's also in the hopper. So.
Oh, perfect. Well, on that note, folks, I want to say thanks to everyone for joining us on the stream. Get bloody good turns. At least metastability of an identity of over 20 the whole time. Thank you for sticking with us for this Sartrean, Hegelian, sometimes Deleuze-Hegelian, if we can withstand the contradiction. No, I'm just taking the piss. I want to say, Todd, everyone, thank you for joining us. And everyone, Embracing Alienation is out now. This is a launch, but it's been a long time coming. It is out now. You can buy it from Repeater. You can buy it from all good bookstores, and of course Amazon, which is the one bad one. But still, it's okay. You will never find the identity of the ethical consumption. But is that too Adornian? We'll have to figure it out next time. Todd, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Alex. Always a pleasure.